What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new, my name is Josh, and in today's video, I'm going to talk a bit about relationships. Some of that is going to be my personal relationship, my marriage with my wife. Some of it is going to be things that I'm seeing from people close to me and the dynamics in which their relationship are kind of operating. And some of it might just be things that I feel about, people in their late 20s, early 30s and relationships and trends that maybe I see. I'm not huge on social media, so maybe I'm not keeping up with all of it. But I think the topics that I'm gonna discuss, if you're watching this, you're probably watching it because maybe you feel a certain way about your relationship. Maybe some of the things I talk about are things that you're seeing from your partner. Maybe they're a slap in the face and they're things that are what you're experiencing right now or how you feel you're contributing to the relationship. One thing that I love about relationships, I love about couples is it's always both partners that are contributing. But because we're human, we often feel like we're never the problem. It's always the other person. I was visiting with a friend recently who had talked about how him and his wife had gone to couples therapy early on in their relationship because he wanted to change how outspoken she was. He wanted her to be more, to speak up essentially more in the relationship. And I remember sitting there listening to that, not in a judgmental way, but thinking how interesting it is because when Haley and I go to couples therapy, one of the things that our therapist told us early on in our process was that oftentimes, nearly all the time, couples go into couples therapy because they think that there's something wrong with the other person. And their hope is that the therapist can see that and try and fix something about the other person. And that's wrong. It's wrong. And so when I heard this person saying that, it just kind of made me laugh inside because it made me realize how often we feel like there's something going wrong with our partner that we have never contributed to. Or there's something just going on wrong in the relationship that we're not happy with that we have nothing to do with. It's solely on our partner. I have been guilty of this. I probably am too, till this day, still guilty of this in some way. We're not perfect. We're human beings. I've always kind of lived by the saying that if a human being is involved, something will go wrong. That's just who we are. Like we're meant to make mistakes. What's important is that we can learn from these mistakes. So if you're watching this video and maybe you're like, my relationship's in the fucking gutter and I don't see any way out. There's a way out. There's 100% a way out. It might not be the way that you envision it, but what I can say is that it does take you and your partner fully committing to your relationship and trying to make it out together. One of the things that I see often right now is like uneven effort in the relationship. There's two people and one person feels like the other person isn't fully contributing. Maybe they're not fully invested. Maybe they seem preoccupied with something. And that can come in a lot of different ways. Some of that could be physical, sexually related. Some of that could be emotionally. Some of that could be mental. One of the things that I struggled with was, you know, I joined the military pretty much right out of high school. And the military forces you to grow up super quick. You have to learn how to live more independently. You have to learn how to clean and cook for yourself and kind of operate as an adult, but also you're being told how to do everything as well. My wife didn't go to the military. She went to school. So when we first met, there was a lot of things that I knew how to do that I just kind of anticipated and expected her to know how to do. And that was really difficult for me to feel like I was almost adulting for her in a way. And I just had to learn that her life experience was completely different than mine. And it wasn't fair to me to hold her to kind of this expectation that she should know how to do certain things that I know how to do already. So there was kind of this feeling of an uneven effort early on in our relationship where I felt like I was contributing in more ways to certain aspects of our relationship than she was. What I wasn't willing to admit was that there was a lot of emotional and mental things that she was contributing to the relationship that I was really lacking, and learned a few years later like that was really detrimental. Now I've grown in those areas, and I think that my wife and I are about as 50-50 as we can get. But also, it's really important to me that my relationship with my partner is 50-50. Not always, not in every single area, but for the most part, I want our relationship to be as 50-50 as possible. And I think she feels the same way. I think we're pretty much in agreement on that. I also understand that there's some couples that don't want to operate that way. And if that works for them, that's fine. The problem is that I think that there's a lot of couples who aren't having that type of conversation on what effort looks like. And it's not even effort in the sense of what are you doing to match what I'm doing? It's an effort of sort of this like I don't really know how to explain. It's like if you don't feel like your partner is doing something, are you communicating that to them? And if you're not, why? And this kind of goes into an area that I think I could get really long winded on, so I'm not going to try to on that. I was told something a very long time ago, and by a long time ago, I mean a few years ago. Am I listening to respond or am I listening to understand? And if you've never heard that before, I want you to kind of stop and think about what that means. Oftentimes, as human beings, and I think it's totally normal, we listen to people, and while we're listening to them, we're already developing and articulating a response in our head to either agree or counter what they're saying. And what that does when you do that is it prohibits you from fully understanding what that person is trying to say. How can you really understand what someone is saying while the process of them talking, you're already starting to develop a response in your head? And for me, and I think for a lot of people, that's what people do, especially when it's a conversation that's sort of conflict related, or it's an argument. And this can be your partner, a coworker, a friend. You'll know too, when you start to grow as a person and you start to try and understand people for who they are and not trying to respond to what they're saying, you'll see when you're talking and how they respond back to you, if they were trying to understand you or if they were trying to respond to you, and give their side of the story. And I think a reason why people do that is because we're so ego driven. We our feelings get hurt when someone says something that our mind doesn't necessarily agree with, especially when you're talking to your partner and they're trying to be honest with you about how they feel. We become sensitive to that, whether that's shame or guilt or anger. Those emotions are at the core of why we respond, you know? And I think in order to be able to stop responding to people and start understanding, we have to kind of remove ourselves from the equation of that. And what you can do is when you're listening to understand, it allows you the opportunity to fully hear out what that person is saying. So, one of the ways that my wife and I learned how to do that is through what we call dialogue. And, in the therapy world, if you're in counseling, you may hear your therapist do this. They call it mirroring. One of the ways that you can do this with your partner is when you hear them say something to you after they're done talking, try and repeat it back to them. It doesn't have to be word for word, but you want to repeat back to them the general scope of what they said. And what that is doing is it's taking what they said, it's reverberating it back to them, and it's allowing them to hear it and go, yes, that is what I said. That is, I like what I said, and I'm going to say, yes, that is what I said. Or they may hear it and go, no, that was wrong. And it'll give them the opportunity to repeat back. Or they may say, that is what I said, but I actually don't like how that sounded. I want to change that a bit and say it again in a different way. So that's really important because, when you're trying to genuinely understand where someone is coming from, you're giving them an opportunity to speak their truth, but you're also growing in yourself by removing your pride from the situation. You're removing your ego from it. You might not love what they're saying, but you're giving yourself an opportunity to grow and an opportunity for them to grow. I think another area that I see, you know, people in my life struggling with is just open communication with each other. It kind of ties into dialogue, but dialogue is very like specific to trying to understand understand specifically what someone is saying to you. Communication is just very open. It's, are you two speaking openly with each other? Are you having honest, hard, and raw conversations? It doesn't mean it has to be all the time. But as we grow in a relationship, we change. We evolve as individuals. We grow as human beings. Sometimes we don't grow in the ways that we want to. And if we're not openly communicating with our partners about where we are at in life, how we're feeling about things in life, that can create a real rift and a disturbance in the relationship. You know, I see this happen, and it's always one of the things I see is there's always a but or an excuse for why change can't evolve in the relationship. I have, some people close to me, and, you know, stress is a huge component of all of our lives. I think stress does more damage to our bodies physically and mentally than we would like to believe and lead on. But you'll notice sometimes when someone is not at their best, there's some form of stress going on. And that's fine. No one is I don't think anyone's blaming anyone for having stress in their life. I think what's important is a lot of the trends that I see with people is they're willing to kind of excuse poor behavior because of the stress. And my thought process is, well, stress is never going to go away. Like, this specific stress moment may be happening right now, and sure, when that stressful incident is over with, things may get better. But what happens when the next stressful moment comes? Are we just going to continue to allow the relationship to operate in the way that it has when stressful things occur? Or do we need to change the dynamic in which we operate when stressful things happen? How we react to the stress? What do we do as a team when the stress comes? And I don't think couples are willing to address that. We want to get kind of caught up in this, we'll just we'll just weather the storm. Yeah, well, the storm isn't going to get better next time. You're not working on the structure of the foundation. You're just kind of letting the storm beat up the foundation over and over and over in hopes that your foundation lasts long enough to weather it. But that's the thing, the storm's never going to stop. It's just a matter of when. When does it come back? So, that's something that's really difficult for me to watch because I've seen so many times couples that they know the answers. They know what is wrong. They know what they should be doing, but neither one of them is willing to commit to trying to take the steps to make things work. And my thought process is that if things are that bad, you two should be committing to couples therapy. I think you need to erase that stigma that couples therapy is for the worst of the worst. But if you two are talking about divorce, or if you're not talking to each other, maybe you're that group of people that you think needs couples therapy. I don't think there's any shame in putting in the effort or the work to try and better each other as a team. I started thinking about mental health as sort of like a physical thing. Our brains are our muscles. And I think everyone would agree that physical fitness is good for you, it's important. But for some reason, we look at working on your mental health as something only like sick people do. And I just, for me, it's easy to say I just don't get it. I understand why there's a stigma, but I think if you're unwilling to contribute an hour a week to your relationship as a couple, what are you saying about your relationship? If you can't put aside 1 hour a week, 1 hour every 2 weeks to go talk to someone, is your relationship truly that important to you? If you're able to come up with an excuse for why you can't do couples therapy, then why are you in the relationship? That is something that doesn't make sense to me anymore. I think I understand why people fear it. I think in maybe a lot of ways, they're scared of the amount of work it will take. And it does take a lot of work. But if you care enough about making your relationship work, it's worth it. In my opinion, you learn a lot of things about your partner, about how to talk to each other, about how to navigate conflict through couples therapy. And I think you just have to admit the fact that maybe you don't have all the answers. The way that you are talking to each other does not work. Yelling and shouting at each other does not work. It never has. So, what are you willing to do to try and make your relationship better as a team? Are you guys going to commit to that? Or are you going to keep trying to do the same things over and over, hoping that just one day something changes? So I hope that wasn't too negative. And this isn't me trying to be a sponsor for couples therapy. It worked for Haley and I. We still go to couples therapy. We've gotten to a point where we don't have to go weekly. We go every few months now because we have a system, we have a better understanding of how to talk to each other. We understand how to navigate each other when things get tougher in life. Haley understands me better now through couples therapy, and I understand her better now through couples therapy. She knows how to navigate me when I'm feeling a little off. And sometimes I just feel off. It's not always about her, it's not always something she did. I've also learned that if it is something she did, or if I am just feeling off and it has nothing to do with her, I have to communicate those things to her. I have to be transparent and vocal about what is going on so she knows how to either be there or act or not act. Yeah. So, to kind of tie everything back in, I hope if you're watching this, it was able to maybe bring some insight to you. Maybe you were able to reflect. I hope maybe some of this resonated with you. If you're, scared or you're timid about having that conversation with your partner, there's ways to do it. Sometimes it's not always vocal. Sometimes one way you can do it is if, you can always write a letter. I think letters are a great way of trying to communicate if vocal communication doesn't work the best. Sometimes you just need to write a letter out and give it to them and just be honest, say how you feel and things that you think may work or how you want to see your relationship grow. If your partner isn't in it to grow and work with you on, then you have to have a conversation with yourself about what your future looks like, if that involves them or not. So anyway, I appreciate you, stopping by and listening to the video. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. As I always say, please drop a comment on any topics or subjects that you'd like to hear me discuss in the future. Please leave a like. It does help the channel a lot. Please subscribe. It would be greatly appreciated. And with that being said, I will see you next time.